INTJ, INFJ, INFP, INTP. Distancing begins long before conflict appears. There's a moment in a conversation when something changes. Not loudly, not dramatically. Someone who used to stay in the discussion starts answering a little shorter. A message becomes 2 words instead of 5 sentences. A story ends earlier than it used to. They're still there, but something already stepped back, and most people never notice the moment it begins. For INTJ, INFJ, INFP, and INTP types, distancing often begins as a cognitive protection pattern. At first, it doesn't look like withdrawal. It looks like patience. They listen, they nod, they let the conversation move forward. But internally, a quiet calculation has already started. Something felt slightly off. Not enough for conflict, but enough for distance. INxx types often start withdrawing before problems become visible. If you've ever watched yourself slowly stop explaining things to someone, you probably didn't notice when the decision actually happened. It rarely happens during the argument. It happens before it. During the moment when you realize that explaining something again might not change anything. So you reduce engagement, not openly. Just enough that the relationship becomes quieter. But the reason this happens is different for each INxx type. From the outside, the behavior can look identical. Shorter responses, less emotional investment, less energy in the conversation. Internally, the cognitive process is completely different. For INTJs, distancing is usually a strategic response. NI begins detecting a long-term pattern, not a single event, a trajectory. Something about the relationship starts to look inefficient, unstable, or unsustainable. TE begins reorganizing behavior. Instead of confrontation, the system adjusts. Less emotional exposure, less conversational investment. Not out of cruelty, but because the internal system concluded something important. The interaction is unlikely to improve. FI, sitting deeper in the stack, still feels the disappointment. But INTJs rarely process that feeling out loud. So the visible behavior becomes simple. Strategic retreat. INTJ distancing protects long-term stability. For INFJs, the shift usually begins in emotional saturation. NI notices subtle emotional patterns in the relationship, small signals, tone changes, unspoken tension. FE keeps absorbing and regulating the emotional atmosphere. For a while, they keep smoothing everything, listening, understanding, maintaining harmony, but eventually the emotional load becomes too heavy. So INFJs quietly reduce emotional access, not because they stopped caring, but because caring without reciprocity begins to feel unsafe. TI steps in silently. It analyzes the relationship and starts creating boundaries. The result isn't confrontation, it's quiet emotional distance. INFJ distancing protects emotional energy. For INFPs, the withdrawal usually begins inside their value system. FI starts feeling something small but important, a subtle violation of meaning. Maybe the conversation dismisses something they care about. Maybe the emotional tone feels dishonest. NE explores possibilities. Maybe it was accidental, maybe it was temporary, so they keep engaging for a while, but the feeling doesn't disappear. SI stores the emotional memory. The next similar moment triggers the same internal discomfort. Eventually, FI stops trying to explain. Because explaining values repeatedly begins to feel like self-betrayal. So the engagement becomes softer. Not because the relationship exploded, because the meaning behind it slowly changed. INFP distancing protects personal values. For INTPs, distancing often begins as cognitive fatigue. TI analyzes the conversation. It notices circular reasoning, unproductive arguments, emotional expectations that don't follow logic. NE tries exploring new angles, new explanations, new ways to frame the discussion. But if every path leads back to the same misunderstanding, something in the system disengages. TI stops investing energy, not emotionally, cognitively. FE, lower in the stack, quietly avoids emotional friction. So instead of arguing or correcting the dynamic, INTPs simply stop participating at the same level. They remain present, but the cognitive engagement is gone. INTP distancing protects mental energy. From the outside, all four types can look similar. Quieter, less expressive, more distant in conversation. But the internal motivation is different. INTJ protects long-term strategic stability. INFJ protects emotional capacity. INFP protects personal values. INTP protects cognitive energy. Here's the quiet contradiction. Most INxx types believe that distancing prevents deeper emotional damage, and sometimes it does. But distancing also creates something else, a silent gap, one that other people rarely understand, because the withdrawal began long before the visible problem appeared. If you've ever slowly reduced how much you explain yourself to someone, the decision probably happened weeks before anyone noticed. And here's the uncomfortable part. Many INxx types believe this behavior is maturity, calm, self-control, emotional discipline. But sometimes it's something else. A quiet exit from a conversation that was never fully confronted. Distance can hide unresolved conflict. And by the time others realize the distance exists, the internal decision may have already been made. Not loudly, just quietly enough that no one noticed the moment the relationship changed.